Now, our next item here on the agenda is the panel of ministers for gender equality in the Nordic countries. And I'm sorry to inform you that the minister from Norway, her name is Trine Skei Grande. She had to leave Iceland earlier than had been supposed, so she will not be joining us to this panel. But we have the ministers from Finland and Iceland for gender equality. That is Katrín Jakobsdóttir, that I've already introduced to you. And then we have also Thomas Blomqvist, who is the Minister for Gender Equality and Nordic Cooperation in Finland. Just a few words about Thomas. He has been a member of parliament since 2007 for the Swedish People's Party in Finland. Since 1993, he has also been a local councillor in his hometown Raseborg in southern Finland, where he lives on his family farm. We will also be joined by Paula Lehtomäki, the General Secretary for the Nordic Council of Ministers. And they are now all being wired up, having their microphones connected. But before they enter the stage, I would just like to inform you or make a remark about the declaration that the Nordic Ministers for Gender Equality declared at the 63rd session of the Commission of the Status of Women and at the bilateral meeting and in New York in March 2019. They declared, the ministers of the Nordic countries for gender equality, as a support towards the role of the UN Women in the realization of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, that they gave a positive remark towards the MeToo movement, and they said that it directed our attention towards the gender gap index of the World Economic Forum, which is one of those important indexes that we need to keep an eye on. It measures access to education and health, as well as political and labor market participation of women and men. And now I would like to quote the declaration directly. It says, "It does, however, not measure the prevention and protection from gender-based and sexual violence." And this is extremely important. And as the MeToo movement has revealed, the ministers said in the declaration, a huge room for improvement remains in the Nordic countries and beyond. As such, the MeToo revolution can be seen as the missing gender equality indicator, measuring the level of sexism and misogyny. So the declarations of the Minister of the Nordic countries for gender equality is quite clear. And now we have the opportunity to get the details. So welcome to the stage, Katrín Jakobsdóttir, Thomas Blomqvist, and Paula Lehtomäki. I would like to sit just here and
right. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thomas,
Fine.
we hadn't met properly. Nice to meet you. Well, are we all connected? How are the technicians with us? Okay, and you can hear us. Perfect. Now, for the questions. We have the heading of this conference quite clear, moving forward, and we have the three themes: why now, what next, and MeToo and the Nordic countries. The first question that I would like to pose to you is what characterized the MeToo movement in your country, because it differed a little from one country to another. So if you could tell us just in a few words what characterized the movement in your country, and maybe what was, in your opinion, the most important message that it gave to us. Katrín, can I ask you to start?
Okay. Well, as you know, it really all erupted in November 2017. And in Iceland, I think it was characterized by the keyword solidarity that was being spoken about earlier, that what happened was that women told their stories, but they were believed. And I thought that was actually a very important point, that they were believed in generally. And also, in Iceland, the stories were mostly shared anonymously, which I'm not sure that was the case in the other Nordic countries. There was a lot of discussion about whether the perpetrators should be named or not, but most of the stories were shared anonymously. And I think that conversation might continue here. What does that mean, really? Why did we do it that way? But I think at least doing that showed really that it was a structural problem. It was not about individual perpetrators, but it was really about culture and structure that was so general that you could say it applied to every sector of society. And maybe, as I mentioned in my speech, the stories told by the migrant women were maybe those who were most shocking to us here in Iceland, because they revealed such deep-rooted double discrimination. And finally, on a personal note, what I thought was important was that everybody, we were talking about it in the public, but we were also talking about it in the private sphere. People, friends of mine, even from college, were coming to me and saying, I have been thinking. So it was really not only just a public debate, people were also talking about it at home in their kitchen.
Okay, thank you, Katrín. And Thomas, would you continue? What characterized the movement in Finland?
Well, I acknowledge what you say. It happened also in Finland. The public discussion about sexual harassment, and I think, like in every other Nordic country, it was public discussions right away after the powerful message was delivered. And I think Emma Holten described it very, very well. Everyone has known that the sexual harassment, that it occurs, but at least I realized just then that it also is structural, that the system we have is upholding and allowing this to happen, and that's a very big problem. And I would say this was the a very important message that MeToo delivered. And the discussion in the private sphere, when you have to think about what's okay and what's not okay. And I think I'm a man, and I think there were men that didn't realize that the way they behaved or spoke was not okay. But there were also, and still is, men using their position, their power, and the system to continue to do in a way you shouldn't do. But it was an eye-opener also in Finland, very much so, I would say.
Okay. Paula, you might have followed it on a Nordic scale, probably. What would be your remarks on the characterization? Was there something that you saw different from one country to another?
I think that if I try to draw some conclusions or what are the most important features of the movement on the Nordic level, so as I said in the beginning already, that it was a kind of a wake-up call in that regard, that we are countries who are among the most progressive in the world as regards the gender equality. And sometimes it's easy to think that we are doing good. So suddenly came all this visibility for this issue, for sexual harassment and violations. And I think that to some extent it was also shocking that it is so common. It is very, very common. And if you are part of the structures, as we heard, it is easy to forget about it. So the visibility really is important, because if you don't see it, if you don't talk about it, it does not exist. So it brought it to the agenda. And then another conclusion was very, very clear, that we have to take actions. That we have to do something, not only on the national level, but also together. and then several actions followed, and of course the work is just in the beginning.
But what is interesting is, of course, that the Nordic countries all have legislation already in place that forbids sexual harassment. Yeah. So now I would like to turn the attention to the governments. I mean, how did the governments react, and are they still reacting? Are they reconsidering? I mean, what do we need to do if the legislation that we already have in place doesn't work properly? Katrín, could you start on this one?
Yes, I think the MeToo movement actually showed that legislation isn't enough, and it's about a much more deep-rooted problem which lies in our culture. And it was absolutely right that Emma Holter mentioned earlier. It really showed the fact that when we are talking about gender-based violence, sexual harassment, etc., we're talking about a structural problem and not an coincidence in individuals' lives. And we cannot solve it by individual solutions. We need to have structural solutions. What happened in Iceland after the movement, actually, was that we got a very strong reaction, not only from the politicians, because the government actually showed a very strong reaction, but also from the labor unions, but also the employers. Actually, we had a meeting very shortly after where both individual companies, but also, as I said, the labor unions, the trade unions signed the declaration alongside with institutions and representatives of the government saying, we are going to have a zero tolerance policy on this. And what has happened when it comes to the public policy making, all ministries have been following up with their institutions, what have you done? And what we are seeing is that more institutions now have plans to deal with it. But we're also seeing in this new research that Ásta was presenting that we are still faced with a lot of problems. And I was thinking when she was talking, if we had that same percentage of people, for example, of students complaining about bullyism in schools, we would say this is not okay. Mm-hmm. But we are still not there when it comes to the workplace. So I think we need to focus even more on a workplace without harassment and without violence. And I would like to mention the ILO Convention in that comparison. So a lot of things happening, but very important that governments continue their work. So it will actually lead to structural changes.
Yes, thank you. I would also like to remind us of there was an interesting cooperation between the political parties in Iceland.
Yes.
At this point in time, where all the political parties sat down together and said, how can we unite? I mean, this is too big for one party or for a government. How can we unite in addressing what the MeToo movement is telling us?
The longest standing parliamentarian in Iceland, who is here, told me that this was actually the first time that the political parties in Iceland had a meeting where they were not arguing, but actually having a conversation about these issues. So that's a good thing. And one thing I would like to add was that it was a decision of my government to make me also the Minister of Gender Equality. The Prime Minister took over the affairs of gender equality to ensure that the policy would kind of filter down the whole system. Mm-hmm. And so we will see what consequences that will have.
Absolutely. Thomas, the inside impact in your government, how did you perceive that?
Well, our government is appointed just 3 months ago, so it's
so
after,
you were not
after the MeToo, but I think the MeToo affected also the governmental program we had. Yeah. The gender question and the equality questions are very, very, very present in the program, and I think it's at least partly because of the MeToo movement. And I think in Finland, also in Finland as in the other Nordic countries, the legislation is on a good level. But the task for us is to change the culture and to change the system. And I think politicians could, by leadership, by showing what is not okay and what is okay, that we have zero tolerance, that we have a plan also in the ministries and in the community overall to how to end the sexual harassment. And I think I'm prepared to listen to the, Emma Holten said, hysterical, and because I haven't ever been, there you are, I was very impressed. I've never been a victim, but I'm ready to listen to you and to others who have been victim. And I think for me as a Minister of for Gender Equality, it's very important to have a dialogue with the Women's Association, for example, and with those who have experienced these things, and how we can prevent it to happen again. And because it didn't end with MeToo, it still is happening every day in every workplace and everywhere. So it's a big challenge for our government to find the right solutions.
Paula, you might be able to reflect also on how it affected, the MeToo movement affected Finnish politics. Were you in the parliament 2 years ago?
No, but I was very much in the structures in Finland because I was serving as a state secretary to the Prime Minister of Finland the last 4 years. Well, first of all, of course, discussions on legislation, that whether appropriate legislation is in place or not. And legislation has a role to play here because it is what gives a clear signal in a society and in a country that what is appropriate and what is not. I mean, that what kind of behavior is okay and what not. But then, of course, you cannot define in the legislation all these variations that we saw in the presentations also today. And I think that, and I would like to comment what Thomas actually said in his first comment, that within these structures that I'm also part of, people are more and more thinking of their own behavior. That is it appropriate how I'm used to behave myself? And this is very interesting discussion. Of course, we all know that like physical violence is absolutely no-go. But then these jokes and different kind of issues, comments, etc., that also came up in the presentations. People are more and more also looking at the mirror, which is of course good, because that's the place to start when you think that who should act now. Okay, take a mirror and look there, who should act. But if I go back to the legislational issues, then this ILO convention is of course something that we still have work to be done. And let's see in what speed can we see progress in the Nordic region on this. But I think it is also important framework for international cooperation in this area. But it's alone legislation or conventions are not enough. The cultural change requires much more.
A cultural change. I mean, we hear this and we see this here on the slides, that a cultural change is what is needed. And we often see this in politics. We think we have a tool in the legislation to make this cultural change, but somehow the culture changes within people, but not maybe with the legislation. Thomas, what can we do? Is there a tangible possibility that politicians can change or help change a culture in society?
Well, we can help, but we shouldn't believe that we can do everything. But we can help, and we can provide the tools to change the system. But my personal view is like Paula said, it's to take the mirror, everyone, because I think, as you said in your opening speak, that violence against women are a men's issue, and I can't understand it that it really can't be that hard to behave. I can't understand that really, because you should treat every person with respect. Today, rights and to their integrity and in every way. And I can't understand it could be that hard for us to change the system. No. But it is, I know, because the structures are very old and the behavior and what is okay is, at least for men in my age, it could be hard to change. Mm-hmm. But this is not a difficult question. It's only about respecting other people, mm-hmm. and that should not be that hard.
But it has proven difficult. You know,
I know.
I always like to quote John Stuart Mill, because he said it was the most deeply rooted inequality, the inequality between men and women. And that is quite some time ago when he said that in his famous book about the oppression of women, and we are still there. We're still talking about how long it takes to change that culture. But on a more optimistic note, the culture is changing. You just have to look at comedy shows, 10 years old, and you will say, oh my God, that's so sexist. It's not funny. I can promise you. And if you go further back, you will just be amazed that you ever laughed at this. I can tell you also that my 3 sons are watching old Friends shows, and they are, oh, did you really think this was funny? I never watched Friends, so I can say I skipped that part. But I know, so this is really changing. The culture is making progress. And not maybe because of the politicians, but because of the women stepping up and really taking the floor, and they are changing that culture.
Absolutely. And Paula, you had a comment on culture?
Actually, I would like to raise one very concrete example of the impact of MeToo discussion, and that goes back to the working places, that it became, at least in Finland, and I'm sure that also in other Nordic countries, after MeToo discussion evolved, then you started to look in different kind of organizations and working places much more carefully and much more detailed way that what is the situation in our organization as relates to the sexual harassment at the working places, etc. I was leading a big organization myself, and there as well we asked it very detailed way when we made the polls to our employees. But there as well, the problem is that you do not get information very much, even if you ask it, without names. There are only a couple of cases annually that somebody has marked it to this paper that yes, he or she has experienced herself sexual harassment. And then, of course, it is very difficult to find it and to do something about it. But this was very clear that in various organizations that you started to look at this issue at working places. Yeah.
And Thomas?
Yes, I would like to add that, of course, I realize this will take time to change the system and the culture. And it will take years before we can end the sexual harassment. But what I wanted to say is that it is not impossible to do that. And it's not an excuse to accept the situation we have today by saying this is so hard to change. Because at the bottom line, it is not that hard, but it will take time, I know that.
I was also very interested in Perna's slide when she was, we have legislation, we've been talking about that, but to change culture it needs more. And you were saying, Perna, about you have to ensure leadership. And that is something that the politicians have to think of, I think. Ensure leadership at all places. Practice zero tolerance. Embed victim-centered approach. That's also interesting. And update the training. As long as and also as we have to update, the comedy shows and stand-up programs, we have to update the training. Promote collective ownership. Also really interesting. And develop organizational transparency, something that you also touched upon. These are the instruments that we have in our tool cases that we should use, both as politicians and the general public and activists. They know these tools. But we have a final question, I think, for the panel, or a final thought. We wanted to look at this moving forward theme. I mean, in our hearts, we who are here gathered, we all know and want to move forward. But can you mention something, say something? I mean, what would be the next thing on your agenda in order to move forward in the right direction? Katrín.
Well, first about the tools you mentioned and you were presenting. I think they are very important because we have the tools that we need. We just need to use those tools to reach the goal we want to use. But to change the culture, we also need that conversation, intersectional conversation, because we are talking about gender, but we're also talking about class. We're also talking about race. We are talking about, and that's why I mentioned specifically immigrant women in Iceland, because we need to think about the other factors that are having an effect really in this debate. And we need to be very conscious of that. And we also need to listen to the silent voices. I mentioned the disabled women. So I think we need to have that holistic approach when we are thinking about how to move on. We need to continue to review our processes, definitely, and including the judicial system, obviously, but also the health, social, educational system. But we need to find ways to make the conversation move beyond that. And that's really what I'm talking about when I'm talking about this intersectionality. And we also need a dialogue on how to move forward with the perpetrators. With the perpetrators or the alleged perpetrators. And we need to boost our prevention programs. We are working very actively on that in my government, how we can actually increase prevention, not only in the education system, but also in the workplace. And finally, I think the goal should also be very clear, a culture free of sexual harassment, with all these, with this holistic approach where we're thinking about every sector of the system and all the factors that can actually have an effect on this.
Thomas, over to you.
Well, I think we have very much work to do. It is still too difficult and too demanding for the victims to decide to take action, to get support and to seek justice. And despite the laws of against sexual harassment, there is still great need for strengthening understanding of this problem and the measures needed to tackle it. And I think we also have to deepen the work and look at different groups that face sexual harassment. For example, in Finland we have transgender youth that meets harassment very often. We have figures that say that 80% of transgender youth has experienced some sort of harassment. And I would also like to take up the role of bystanders and witnesses of sexual harassment. We all should react and to take stand, like Emma did. And I also think that we have in many ways also new challenges brought to us by the internet and the harassment occurring there. And can the legislation keep up with the digitalization and what it brings on? I think these could be 4 points we should look into.
Thank you. And you, Paula, what is the most important thing that we can do to move forward in Nordic politics in order to change all this?
I don't know if it's most important thing, but certainly we are about to gather also more knowledge. So we are launching a research program on this now for several years in order to gather information on how is it the situation in different Nordic countries, in order to share the best practices and share knowledge that what seems to be working out and what not. So that is also very important that we can take decisions based on updated knowledge. But then something which has become very clear in this discussion has been the strong linkage to general inequality. Mm-hmm. That in places that you have imbalance of power, that people who are in the weaker position and strong position, that increases the risk also for sexual harassment. Mm-hmm. I think that reminds us about the overall gender equality work and its importance. Because when you are more when you have level playing field for all individuals and all people, then it also diminishes the risk for this kind of a harassment. And then I hope that as showing leadership has also become so clear in this discussion, that the Nordic countries and the Nordic region could here also have the courage to show also international leadership and go forward with these issues.
Before I give you the possibility to give final or closing remarks to this panel, there's one curiosity that I would like to ask you, Katrín, about. There was mentioned a barbershop, an Icelandic barbershop in the Icelandic Parliament, where the male parliamentarians came and discussed. Can you elaborate a little bit on that? Is that a tool that bites that we should have in our pockets?
Yes, absolutely. I think this is one of the things that the Icelandic government has been working on for several years, is really involving men and boys more in the discussion on gender equality through the barbershop conferences, which we have been giving both here at home and on the international arena, but also in our general policy making. And I think this is also quite a tipping point. Just when we talk about gender equality in general, it's very important that we are all participating in that debate. It's not just a private affair of women. So this has actually been going very well, and I think this is something that we can actually share our experiences from.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so closing remarks. Thomas, I give it first over to you.
Well, I think that the Nordic countries together can do an impact. We have discussed this question earlier today, and I think in the EU and in the UN we together we can do things to improve the world, and because our values and our systems are also so likely. And the second remark is maybe a personal one. I think the MeToo movement, unfortunately, will be needed for a long time to come. But I trust on the movement that it will continue, and to remind the politicians and everyone in the society that there is still work to be done. And the second thing is that for me it was an eye-opener. As I said before, I have 3 children, 2 daughters and 1 son. I have 3 sisters, of course 1 mother. And I hadn't realized that this problem of sexual harassment was so common. They never told me, but I'm sure some of them has met it somewhere. And I'm afraid that my daughters will meet it again in the future. And from a personal point of view, I will try to do my best to end sexual harassment. And as minister in the Finnish government, I will listen to the hysterical, to everyone who has a point and has experience that I can have use for in my work.
Thank you, Thomas. Paula, What is in your mind now as we're finishing this panel?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'm grateful for this kind of platforms for interaction, because also I have grown up and lived on the bright side of the street. And it's very important to get together to understand also each other. And I hope that we will in the future see more and more also male hysterics, I mean, who question the systems and how it functions. And then I wish us all strength and inspiration, because it's going to be a long way ahead of us. As we look at the developments around the world, it's not very positive. So we need to keep on going, and I hope that we are making progress. But really, it seems that really we can't stop now. No. We are in the beginning of a long way.
In the middle of the river. Katrín, the last words of the panel will be yours.
Thank you. I'll just make 2 points. First, because Iceland keeps being at the top of the Global Gender Gap Index from the World Economic Forum. So I think it was quite a shock for many Icelandic people realizing that the MeToo movement was actually revealing such gross inequalities in our society. In spite of us being on top of that list, we still had those strong cultural and structural inequalities. So it was really an eye-opener for a lot of Icelanders who thought we were just doing quite well and lived in paradise of gender equality. So it was definitely an eye-opener, but it also quite revealed the urgency of continuing everything we are doing, continuing our work. And that brings me to my second point, because right now the international political arena is set. So we are actually seeing a backlash, not only looking to the West, but also in Europe, for example, when it comes to the repoliticizing of women's bodies. So we are seeing a definite backlash. And I think actually the Nordic countries have a very important role to play to ensure that there won't be a backlash in international policy making when it comes to gender equality, that we will keep on progressing, because we are definitely under threat there right now.
Well, dear guests, I would like you to give a good hand to the panelists, and thank you very much.
Thank you.